The floor of the great hall was already stained with the scent of fear before Lyra Wren ever stepped into it. She smelled it the moment the guards pushed the doors open. Sharp, sour, unmistakable. Dozens of Omegas stood in 2 trembling rows, shoulders curled inward, eyes fixed on the polished stone beneath their feet. Not one of them dared look up. Not one of them dared breathe too loudly. At the far end of the hall, seated on a throne carved from black mountain rock, was the reason. Cale Ashgrave did not need to raise his voice, lift a hand, or even glance in a person's direction to command a room. His presence alone did the work. It rolled off him in slow, crushing waves, an invisible weight that pressed down on every Omega present, until their knees buckled, and their instincts screamed at them to kneel, to submit, to disappear. Lyra had heard the stories. Everyone in the kingdom had. The Alpha King's aura was not cruelty. It was not intended punishment. It was simply what he was, an Alpha born with power so concentrated that no Omega had ever been able to stand upright in his presence for more than a few seconds. Some fainted the instant they crossed the threshold of the hall. Others made it halfway before their legs gave out. The unlucky ones collapsed directly at his feet, in full view of the entire court, and had to be carried out while the nobles whispered behind their hands. It was, the older Omegas said, the closest thing to a curse a king could carry. He could conquer armies. He could rule provinces, but no Omega had ever been able to remain standing before him, and so, no Omega had ever truly known him. Lyra had worked 3 consecutive night shifts at the Pack Infirmary. Her eyes were dry from exhaustion, her limbs heavy in a way that made every step feel like wading through water. She had missed sleep for a birth that went wrong at midnight, and a fever that broke only an hour before dawn. She had been dragged from her cot by a palace steward, with barely enough time to splash water on her face, told that all registered Omegas in her district were required, without exception, to attend the presentation ceremony. She had not eaten, she had not slept, and now she stood in a line of trembling strangers, waiting for her turn to be called, before a king whose very presence was known to drop grown women to the floor. Lyra Wren, the steward called. She startled, blinked hard, and stepped forward. The hall was long, longer than it needed to be, clearly built to make every approaching Omega feel smaller with every step. Lyra walked it anyway, her boots echoing against the stone, her tired mind only half registering the golden light pouring through the high windows, the banners bearing the Ashgrave crest, the rows of silent nobles watching her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She did not feel the aura the way the others described it. She felt tired. She felt her eyelids drooping. She felt the particular, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had not slept properly in 3 days, standing in a warm hall filled with soft golden light, with nothing to do but wait. Cale watched her approach the way he watched every Omega approach, with the practiced detachment of a man who had learned not to hope for anything different. He expected her knees to fold within 10 paces, as they always did. He expected the soft gasp, the collapse, the guards rushing forward to catch her, before her head struck the floor. She did not gasp. She did not stumble. She reached the appointed mark on the stone floor, stopped, folded her hands the way she had been instructed, and lowered her chin in a polite but unremarkable bow. Then she swayed slightly on her feet. Cale's spine straightened. This was it then. Delayed, but the same as always. Lyra's eyes fluttered. And then, in front of the entire royal court, in front of the Alpha King of the realm, in front of nobles who had traveled from every corner of the kingdom to witness the presentation ceremony, Lyra Wren yawned. A long, unhidden, thoroughly undignified yawn, and fell asleep standing up. For one full breath, the great hall was utterly silent. Then chaos, of the quiet, horrified sort, rippled through the crowd. Nobles exchanged wide-eyed glances. A steward near the throne made a strangled sound in his throat. Somewhere in the line of Omegas, someone let out a small, disbelieving laugh before slapping a hand over their own mouth. Lyra's body did not crumple to the floor the way every other Omega's had. Instead, she simply tipped forward, ever so slightly, then caught herself with a small stumble, blinked twice, and straightened up again. The unmistakable motion of someone fighting off sleep after staying awake far too long, not someone overwhelmed by an Alpha's power. She had not fainted. She had dozed off. Cale Ashgrave, who had not been surprised by anything in the throne room in over a decade, felt something shift behind his ribs, a small, strange jolt, like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. "Your Majesty," the steward began, voice tight with panic, already moving toward Lyra to drag her away before the insult could fully register. "Forgive her. She is clearly unwell. I will have her removed at once." "Wait." The single word cut through the hall like a blade. The steward froze mid-step. Kale rose from his throne, a motion so rare during presentation ceremonies that a fresh wave of murmurs spread through the nobles, and descended the 3 stone steps toward the Omega, who was now, belatedly, realizing what she had just done. Lyra's eyes went wide, sleep drained from her expression in an instant, replaced by pure, cold horror as she registered the king standing directly in front of her, closer than any Omega had stood to him in years without collapsing. "I am so sorry," she blurted, dropping into the deepest, most desperate bow she could manage. "Your Majesty, I did not mean. I have not slept in 3 days. I was not trying to disrespect you. Please, I beg you." "Look at me," Kale said. It was not a command laced with power. It was quiet, almost careful. Lyra lifted her head, half convinced she was about to be struck down where she stood, half convinced the guards would haul her away before that could even happen. Instead, she found herself looking directly into the king's face for the first time. Sharp gray eyes, a jaw set with the kind of tension that came from years of controlling something enormous inside himself, and an expression she could not quite name. Not anger, not amusement, something closer to disbelief. "Do you feel it?" Kale asked, low enough that only she could hear. "My presence. Do you feel anything at all?" Lyra blinked, too frightened and too tired to fully understand the question. I feel very warm, Your Majesty, and very tired. I am sorry. I have been working double shifts at the infirmary. There was a difficult birth." "Not the warmth of the hall," Kale said. "Me. Do you feel pressure? Weight? Anything pushing you down?" She hesitated, searching herself honestly, too exhausted to lie even if she had wanted to. "No, Your Majesty. I feel nothing like that. I am only tired." Behind Kale, the entire court had gone deathly silent, straining to hear a conversation they were not meant to be part of. Nobles who had spent years perfecting the art of political stillness now leaned forward, unable to help themselves. Kale studied her for a long moment, the exhausted Omega in a simple gray dress, dark circles under her eyes, dark hair coming loose from its braid, radiating nothing but genuine embarrassment and fatigue. No fear, no submission, no collapse. For the first time in longer than he could remember, an Omega stood before him as an equal, entirely unaware that she had just done something no one else in the kingdom had managed to do. "Take her to the infirmary wing," Kale said, turning to the steward, his voice returning to its usual commanding tone. "Let her rest. She is dismissed from the remainder of the ceremony." "Your Majesty," the steward stammered, "surely some correction is required, some punishment for the disrespect." "She fell asleep from exhaustion after 3 days without rest, tending to the sick of this kingdom," Kale said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That is not disrespect, that is devotion to duty. See that she is compensated for her service, and given proper rest." The steward bowed hastily, clearly relieved to have an order he could follow rather than argue with, and gestured for 2 attendants to guide Lyra from the hall. She went, still stammering half-formed apologies, still certain she had somehow doomed herself, utterly unaware that the king's gray eyes followed her every step until the great doors closed behind her. The presentation ceremony continued. Omega after Omega approached the throne. Omega after Omega collapsed, exactly as they always had, exactly as Kale had come to expect over years of empty, predictable ceremonies. But he barely registered any of them. His mind kept circling back to the hall a few minutes earlier, to an Omega who had not trembled, had not gasped, had not folded beneath the weight he had carried alone his entire life, an Omega who had simply been too tired to notice him at all. By the time the ceremony ended and the hall emptied of nobles and Omegas alike, Kale remained seated on his throne, long after he should have retired to his chambers. Edmund Voss, his steward and closest advisor, approached cautiously, sensing that something in the king's demeanor had changed in a way he could not name. "Your Majesty," Edmund said carefully, "is something troubling you?" Cale did not answer immediately. He was staring at the empty stretch of floor where Lyra Wren had stood, replaying the moment over and over. The yawn, the stumble, the honest confusion in her eyes when he had asked if she felt anything at all. "Find out everything you can about the Omega who fell asleep today," Cale said finally. Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly, though years of court service kept his expression otherwise neutral. "The one from the infirmary district? Shall I prepare a formal reprimand for the record, Your Majesty?" Given the unusual nature of the incident, some in the court may expect. "No reprimand," Cale said. "I want to know her name, her position, her family, everything. Quietly. I do not want this turned into court gossip." "Of course, Your Majesty." Edmund bowed, though his mind was already spinning with questions he knew better than to ask aloud. In all his years serving the Ashgrave line, he had never once seen the king take a personal interest in an individual Omega, let alone one who had, by every account, just committed the single most undignified breach of court protocol in living memory. Cale rose from his throne at last, and made his way toward his private chambers, but his thoughts remained fixed on the hall behind him, on the strange, quiet Omega who had looked at him without fear for the first time in his life. He had spent years believing that no Omega could ever truly stand before him, not out of malice, not out of choice, but because his very nature made it impossible. He had accepted, with the grim resignation of a man used to carrying burdens alone, that he would rule his kingdom without ever knowing what it felt like to have someone meet his gaze, without collapsing beneath it. And then an exhausted infirmary worker had simply fallen asleep in front of him, entirely unbothered by the power that had isolated him his entire life. It should have insulted him. By every rule of court protocol, it should have been treated as an unforgivable offense. Instead, for the first time in years, Cale Ashgrave found himself unable to stop thinking about someone. Across the palace grounds, in the small chamber set aside for exhausted infirmary staff, Lyra Wren finally allowed herself to collapse onto a narrow cot, her body giving out the moment she was no longer standing in front of judgmental eyes. She had no idea that the king had asked after her. She had no idea that a steward was, at that very moment, quietly gathering information about her life, her family, and her position at the infirmary. She only knew that she had somehow fallen asleep in front of the most powerful man in the kingdom, and that she had not been executed for it. She would take that as a victory, she decided, right before sleep pulled her under completely. She had no way of knowing that hundreds of miles away, in the private chambers of the Alpha King, the man whose aura had never failed to bring an Omega to their knees, was staring out over the dark palace grounds, wide awake, thinking of nothing, and no one but her. Something had shifted that morning in the Great Hall. Neither of them yet understood how much. But the kingdom, in time, would come to know the name Lyra Wren, not as the Omega who had disrespected the king by falling asleep in his presence, but as the only person alive who had ever made him feel, for the first time, that he was not entirely alone. For now, though, she slept, unaware, and he watched the horizon, unable to. Edmund Voss did not sleep that night either, though for entirely different reasons than his king. He sat at his desk long after the palace had gone quiet, a single candle burning low beside a stack of district records, searching through name after name until he found the one he needed. Lyra Wren, 23 years old. Registered Omega, District 7, employed at the Pack Infirmary for the past 4 years. No family listed beyond a younger brother, Owen Wren, age 16, currently apprenticed to a blacksmith on the eastern edge of the district. No father listed. Mother deceased 3 years prior. Cause of death recorded simply as illness. Edmund frowned at the sparse details. Most Omega records in the kingdom were thick with information. Family lineage, health assessments, potential match recommendations submitted by hopeful alphas. Lyra's file was thin, almost neglected, the record of someone who had spent her adult life working, rather than being courted. He made a note of the address, the infirmary schedule, and the brother's apprenticeship, then closed the file and rubbed his tired eyes. In all his years serving the Ashgrave court, he had prepared reports on trade disputes, border skirmishes, and the delicate politics of noble marriages. He had never once prepared a report on an Omega the king had taken a personal interest in, because the king had never taken a personal interest in anyone. He told himself it was simple curiosity on Kale's part, an anomaly worth investigating, nothing more. Every ruler wanted to understand the limits of his own power, and Lyra Wren represented an exception to a rule that had defined Kale's entire life. And yet, some quiet instinct told Edmund that the matter was not going to remain simple for very long. Meanwhile, in the infirmary wing where Lyra had been given a cot to recover, her closest friend and fellow healer, Clara Whitfield, arrived at dawn to check on her, carrying a cup of warm broth and an expression caught somewhere between concern and barely contained amusement. "You fainted in front of the king," Clara said, setting the cup down on the small table beside the cot. Lyra groaned and pulled the thin blanket over her face. "I did not faint. I fell asleep. There is a difference." "There is no difference to the entire court," Clara said, though her voice was warm rather than mocking. "Half the kitchen staff already heard about it before the sun came up. They are calling you the Omega, who yawned at the Alpha King." Lyra sat up slowly, her head pounding, the memory of the previous day settling over her like a physical weight. She remembered the golden light of the hall, the endless row of trembling Omegas, the crushing silence right before she had lost the battle against her own exhaustion. She remembered, with a fresh wave of horror, the king's face inches from her own, his gray eyes studying her as though she were some kind of puzzle he needed to solve. "He asked me if I felt anything," she said quietly. "Pressure, he called it. Weight. As though he expected me to feel something pressing down on me." Clara's amusement faded into genuine curiosity. "And did you feel anything?" "I felt tired," Lyra admitted. "That is all. I have never felt whatever it is the others describe. I always assumed I simply had not been close enough to him before yesterday to notice it." "You were standing right in front of him," Clara said slowly. "Lyra, every Omega who gets within 20 paces of the king collapses. You walked the entire length of the hall and only fell asleep because you have not slept properly in 3 days. That is not the same thing at all." Lyra opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, uncertain how to respond. She had been too exhausted and too embarrassed the previous day to consider what her reaction, or lack of one, actually meant. Now, sitting in the quiet infirmary with Clara's words settling over her, a small, uneasy feeling took root in her chest. "It does not matter," she said finally, forcing herself to stand despite the ache in her legs. "I disgraced myself in front of the entire court, and somehow was not punished for it. I intend to go back to my duties, keep my head down, and never think about that hall again." Clara gave her a look that suggested she did not believe that plan would work out quite so simply. But she said nothing further, only handed Lyra the cup of broth, and watched her drink it in silence. Neither of them could have known that, at that very moment, in a private study across the palace grounds, Edmund Voss was standing before the king, with a thin file in his hands, about to change the course of both their lives. "Her name is Lyra Wren," Edmund said, placing the file on the desk before Kale. 23 years old, employed at the district infirmary. No official match recommendations on record. Her mother passed 3 years ago. She has a younger brother she appears to be supporting on her own. Kale read through the sparse details slowly, absorbing each fact as though it held some hidden significance. An Omega who worked to support her family rather than waiting to be matched. An Omega who had walked the length of the Great Hall without so much as a flicker of submission in her posture, simply because exhaustion had dulled her senses to everything, including him. "Has anyone else in the district ever reported an immunity to my presence?" Kale asked. "Not that I am aware of, Your Majesty. In all the records I could find, going back 3 generations, no Omega has ever failed to react to an Alpha King's aura in the manner Miss Wren did yesterday." Kale set the file down and stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tight with something that looked, to Edmund's careful eye, remarkably like restrained hope. "I want her summoned to the palace," Kale said finally, "not as a punishment. As a guest. Tell her it concerns a matter of importance to the crown, and nothing more." Edmund hesitated, choosing his next words with the caution of a man who had served long enough to know when a king's request carried weight far beyond its simple phrasing. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, what is it you hope to learn from her?" Kale was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on some point beyond the window, beyond the palace walls, beyond anything Edmund could see. I do not know yet, Kale admitted. But for the first time in a very long while, I intend to find out. Edmund bowed and left to arrange the summons, leaving the king alone with his thoughts and the thin, unremarkable file of an Omega who had, without meaning to, cracked open a door that had been sealed shut for as long as anyone could remember. The summons arrived at the infirmary 2 days later, carried by a palace guard whose polished armor and rigid posture drew stares from every healer and patient in the ward. Lyra was elbow-deep in bandages when she saw him approach, and her stomach dropped the moment he called her name. She set down her supplies, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped forward with a calm expression that hid none of the panic building beneath it. Lyra Wren, the guard said, holding out a sealed letter bearing the royal crest. You are summoned to the palace by order of His Majesty, King Kale Ashgrave. You are to present yourself before the evening bell. Clara, who had been folding linens nearby, went very still. Several other healers turned to stare openly, whispers already spreading through the ward like wildfire. Lyra took the letter with trembling hands. Am I being punished? I have not been given that information, the guard said, not unkindly. Only that you are to come, and that you are to come alone. He left without further explanation, and Lyra stood frozen in the middle of the infirmary, the sealed letter heavy in her hands, certain that whatever mercy the king had shown her 2 days earlier had finally run its course. You are not being punished, Clara said firmly, though the tightness in her voice suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Lyra. If he wanted to punish you, he would have done it in front of the entire court that day. This is something else. That is not comforting, Lyra muttered, breaking the seal with unsteady fingers. The letter inside was short, written in a firm, efficient hand that gave nothing away. You are requested to appear before His Majesty regarding a matter of importance to the crown. A carriage will arrive within the hour. Your position and wages at the infirmary will remain secure, regardless of the outcome of this meeting. She read it 3 times, searching for hidden threats between the formal lines, and found none. That, somehow, made her more nervous rather than less. She spent the ride to the palace rehearsing apologies, certain that whatever awaited her would require groveling, explanations, perhaps even a formal punishment she had somehow avoided the first time. By the time the carriage rolled to a stop before the palace gates, her hands were damp with sweat, and her mind was a chaotic tangle of worst-case scenarios. She was led not to the great hall where the presentation ceremony had taken place, but to a smaller, private study, lined with bookshelves and warmed by a low fire. Kale stood near the window when she entered, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in a posture of quiet contemplation. Your Majesty, Lyra said, dropping into the deepest bow she could manage, her voice barely steady. I apologize again for my conduct at the ceremony. I understand if you require some form of correction. Stand up, please, Kale said, turning to face her. You are not here to be punished. Lyra straightened slowly, still braced for some hidden blow. Then why am I here, Your Majesty? Kale studied her for a long moment, before gesturing toward one of the 2 chairs positioned near the fire. Sit. This conversation will go easier if you are not standing there looking like you expect me to strike you down. She sat, perched on the very edge of the chair, spine rigid, hands folded tightly in her lap. Kale took the seat across from her, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the same kind of exhaustion she recognized from her own reflection after long shifts at the infirmary. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, Kale said. Not the answer you think will please me, the truth. Yes, Your Majesty. When you stood before me at the ceremony, before you fell asleep, did you feel any pressure? Any instinct to kneel, to look away, to submit in any manner at all? Lyra hesitated, uncertain why the question seemed to matter so much to him, but she had never been skilled at dishonesty, even under pressure. No, Your Majesty. I felt tired, warm perhaps, from the crowd and the light through the windows, but nothing beyond that. I did not feel any pressure pushing against me, if that is what you mean. Kale's expression remained carefully neutral, but something in his shoulders eased slightly, as though a question he had carried for a long time had finally received an answer he needed to hear. Do you understand what my presence typically does to Omegas? He asked. I have heard the stories, Lyra admitted carefully, that your aura is very strong, that Omegas often faint in your presence. They do not simply faint, Kale said, his voice quieter now, almost tired. They collapse the moment they come within a certain distance of me. Some manage a few steps before their legs give out entirely. In all my years as king, in all the presentation ceremonies and formal audiences and public appearances I have endured, not a single Omega has ever remained standing and aware in my presence. Until you. Lyra blinked, absorbing the weight of what he was telling her. I did not realize it was quite so severe, Your Majesty. Most people outside the court do not, Kale said. It is not something I advertise. It is simply the reality I have lived with since I came into my full power as a young man. I have learned to expect it. I have stopped hoping for anything different. He paused, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though something kept her holding his gaze instead. And then you walked the length of my hall without so much as a flinch, and fell asleep from nothing more than exhaustion. I am sorry if that offended you, Lyra said quietly. It did not offend me, Kale said. It was the first time in my life that I have stood in front of an Omega who looked at me the way any other person would, not with fear, not with submission. Simply with tiredness, because you had not slept, and I happened to be standing in front of you. Lyra did not know how to respond to that. She had spent the entire carriage ride preparing for punishment, for cold formality, for anything but this strange, quiet honesty from a man the entire kingdom feared. I would like to understand why, Kale continued, whether it is something particular to you, some anomaly in your nature, or something else entirely. I have already asked the court healers to review what is known about aura resistance, though I suspect they will find little of use. In the meantime, I would like your permission to have you examined, and I would like to speak with you further, if you are willing. Examined how, Your Majesty? Lyra asked, a note of wariness creeping into her voice despite herself. Nothing invasive, Kale assured her. Simple observations. Measurements of your reaction to my presence at varying distances. Perhaps some questions about your family history, your health, anything that might explain what makes you different from every other Omega who has ever stood before me. He paused, and for a moment, something almost vulnerable flickered across his composed features. I understand. If you would prefer not to be involved in this, it is an unusual request, and I have no right to demand your cooperation. Lyra considered the offer carefully. She had come to the palace expecting punishment, and found instead a king who seemed almost desperate for answers to a question that had clearly haunted him for years. There was something disarming about his honesty, something that made her forget, for a moment, that she was speaking to the most powerful man in the kingdom, rather than simply a tired, curious stranger. I am willing to help, Your Majesty, she said finally. Though I must return to my duties at the infirmary, my brother depends on my wages, and the patients there depend on my care. Your position will not be affected, Kale said. I will ensure any time required for these observations does not interfere with your work or your income. You have my word. Lyra nodded slowly, still uncertain what she had just agreed to, but something in the king's demeanor, the quiet desperation beneath his controlled exterior, the years of isolation she could sense hovering just beneath his careful composure, made it difficult to refuse him. Thank you, Kale said, and for the first time since she had entered the room, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. You have no idea what this means to me. Lyra did not fully understand it herself, not yet, but as she was led out of the study and back toward the waiting carriage, she found herself replaying his words over and over, unable to shake the strange, unfamiliar feeling that something significant had just begun. Behind her, Kale remained in the study long after she had gone, staring at the chair she had occupied, allowing himself, for the first time in years, the fragile and dangerous luxury of hope. The palace healers arrived at the infirmary 3 days later, a small procession of robed figures led by Rosalind Hale, the court's chief healer, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. Lyra had been given advance notice this time, which did little to ease her nerves as she watched them set up various instruments on a table borrowed from the infirmary's supply room. This will not hurt, Rosalind said, though her clipped, businesslike tone offered little comfort. We will begin with simple measurements. Heart rate, breathing, pupil response, at increasing distances from His Majesty. Nothing more invasive than that. unless the initial findings suggest further examination is warranted. Kale stood near the far wall of the small examination room the palace had arranged, deliberately keeping his distance until the procedure began. He had insisted on being present himself, rather than sending a proxy, a decision that had raised more than a few eyebrows among the healers, though none of them dared voice their surprise aloud. "Are you ready?" Rosalind asked Lyra, who sat perched on a wooden stool, a measuring cuff already fastened around her arm. "As ready as I can be," Lyra said, offering a small, nervous smile. The first test was simple. Kale stood at the far end of the room, roughly 20 paces away, and Rosalind recorded Lyra's heart rate, her breathing, the dilation of her pupils. Nothing changed. Lyra sat calmly, watching the proceedings with mild curiosity rather than fear, while the healers exchanged quiet, puzzled glances behind their notebooks. 10 paces, Rosalind instructed, and Kale moved closer. Still nothing. Lyra's pulse remained steady, her breathing even. She watched Kale approach with open curiosity, the same way she might watch any other person cross a room, without so much as a flicker of the instinctive fear that gripped every other Omega who came within his range. 5 paces, Rosalind said, and this time there was an edge of genuine astonishment creeping into her clinical tone. Kale stepped closer still, close enough now that Lyra could see the faint tension in his jaw, the careful control he exercised over every movement, as though he expected her reaction to change at any moment. It did not. Her heart rate ticked up slightly, but only in the way anyone's might when someone important stood close to them, not the racing, panicked spike the healers had documented in every previous case of Omega proximity to the king. "Remarkable," Rosalind murmured, scribbling notes furiously. "In 4 decades of practice, I have never recorded a reading like this." "Continue," Kale said quietly, his eyes fixed on Lyra rather than the healer. They tested proximity at increasingly close distances, each time recording the same baffling results. Lyra's body simply did not respond to Kale's presence the way biology and instinct dictated it should. When he stood directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes, her pulse remained calm, her breathing even, her posture relaxed rather than submissive. "I do not understand it," Rosalind admitted finally, setting down her notes with an expression of genuine bewilderment. "There is no physiological marker I can find that would explain this level of resistance. By every measure available to us, Miss Wren's body simply does not register His Majesty's aura as a threat, or as anything requiring a submissive response at all." "Could it be a flaw in her senses?" one of the younger healers asked, immediately shrinking back under Rosalind's sharp glance. "Forgive me, I only meant to ask whether some deficiency might explain." "Her senses appear entirely normal in every other respect," Rosalind said firmly. "Her hearing, her sight, her reflexes, all within expected ranges for a healthy Omega of her age. This is not a deficiency. This is something else entirely, and I confess I have no immediate explanation for it." Kale listened to the exchange with quiet intensity, his gray eyes never leaving Lyra, who sat through the entire examination with remarkable patience, occasionally offering small, wry observations that eased the tension in the room, despite the gravity of what was being discussed. "Perhaps I am simply too tired to be afraid of anything anymore," she offered at one point, drawing a startled laugh from one of the younger healers before Rosalind's stern glance silenced it. "There may be some truth in that," Rosalind said thoughtfully, tapping her pen against her notes. "Chronic exhaustion can dull certain instinctive responses over time, but even accounting for that, the degree of resistance we are observing goes far beyond what fatigue alone could explain." The examination continued for the better part of an hour, testing various scenarios, various distances, various circumstances, designed to provoke some flicker of the response every other Omega exhibited in Kale's presence. Nothing worked. By the end of the session, Rosalind had filled several pages of notes with observations she readily admitted she could not fully explain, and the small examination room had grown thick with a strange, expectant silence. "I would like to review the historical records," Rosalind said finally, addressing Kale directly. "There have been rare cases throughout the kingdom's history of unusual resistances among certain bloodlines, though nothing quite matching what we have observed today. It is possible Miss Wren's family carries some trait that is not manifested in generations, though I cannot confirm that without further research." "Do whatever research you require," Kale said. Take whatever time you need. I want a full understanding of this, not a rushed conclusion." Rosalind bowed and began gathering her instruments, gesturing for the other healers to do the same, leaving Kale and Lyra alone in the small room for the first time since the examination had begun. "I am sorry I could not provide you with a clearer answer, Your Majesty," Lyra said, unfastening the measuring cuff from her arm and setting it aside. "You have nothing to apologize for," Kale said. "You have given me more today than years of hoping ever did. Whatever the explanation turns out to be, the fact remains that you are able to stand before me without fear, without collapse, without any of the burden my presence usually places on those around me. That is not a small thing, Lyra." It was the first time he had used her given name rather than her formal title, and something in the casual familiarity of it sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "May I ask you something, Your Majesty?" she said. "Of course. Has it truly been so difficult? Being unable to stand close to anyone without them fainting." Kale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward some distant point beyond the palace walls. "You cannot imagine what it is like to walk into any room and know, before you even speak a word, that your simple presence will cause harm to those around you. I learned as a young man to keep my distance from everyone, to avoid gatherings, to limit my public appearances as much as duty allowed. I have ruled this kingdom for years, Lyra, and in all that time, I have never once had a conversation with an Omega who was not either unconscious or actively fighting to remain conscious in front of me." The quiet weight of his words settled over the room, and Lyra found herself understanding, for the first time, the true depth of the isolation he had described. It was not simply an inconvenience or a curious quirk of his power. It was a genuine, lifelong loneliness, carried silently behind the composed and commanding exterior the kingdom saw. "That sounds very lonely," she said softly. "It is," Kale admitted, meeting her eyes again. "It has been, for a very long time." Neither of them spoke for a moment, the silence between them somehow comfortable, despite the enormity of what had just been shared. Lyra found herself studying his face more closely than propriety probably allowed, the tension around his eyes that spoke of years of careful control, the faint lines that suggested he smiled far less often than a man his age should, the quiet, guarded hope that flickered somewhere beneath his composed expression whenever he looked at her. "I should return to the infirmary," she said finally, breaking the silence before it could stretch into something she did not fully understand. "Clara will worry if I am gone too long, and there are patients who need attending." "Of course," Kale said, straightening and stepping back to allow her room to rise from the stool. "Thank you for your patience today. I know this cannot have been an easy thing to submit to." "It was strange," Lyra admitted, offering a small smile. "But not unpleasant, Your Majesty." She left the examination room with Rosalind's puzzled notes still echoing in her mind, and the memory of Kale's quiet admission of loneliness, settling somewhere deep and unexpected in her chest. She told herself, on the carriage ride back to the infirmary, that her growing curiosity about the Alpha King was simply that, curiosity, nothing more, the natural interest anyone might feel toward an unsolved mystery. She was not entirely certain she believed herself. Back in the palace, Kale remained in the examination room long after she had gone, turning Rosalind's words over in his mind, turning his own words over as well, surprised by how easily he had opened himself to a woman he had known for less than a week. He had spent years building careful walls around every conversation, every interaction, terrified of revealing too much of the loneliness that had shaped him. With Lyra, those walls had simply fallen away, as though they had never needed to exist between them at all. He did not yet understand what that meant, but he intended to find out, whatever the answer required of him. Word of the king's continued interest in the infirmary, Omega, spread through the palace faster than any official announcement could have managed, carried by the whispers of servants, the sideways glances of nobles, and the increasingly obvious pattern of Kale's schedule. Edmund noticed it first, as he noticed most things concerning the king. Council meetings that once ran until midnight now concluded promptly, freeing Kale's evenings for reasons he never fully explained. Requests for updates on the district infirmaries appeared with unusual frequency on his desk, and on more than one occasion, Edmund found the king standing near the western courtyard, at an hour that corresponded suspiciously well with the end of Lyra's infirmary shifts, watching the road that led toward the district with an intensity he clearly believed went unnoticed. "You could simply invite her back to the palace, Your Majesty," Edmund said one evening, finding Cale in that exact spot, pretending to review a stack of papers he had clearly not read a single word of. "It would save you the trouble of standing in the cold, watching an empty road." Cale did not bother denying it. "Rosalind's research has not produced any answers yet. There is nothing further to discuss with Miss Wren until it does." "Of course, Your Majesty," Edmund said, allowing himself the smallest hint of a knowing smile before retreating, wise enough not to press the matter further. Cale was not entirely certain how to explain, even to himself, why his thoughts kept returning to the quiet infirmary Omega, who had upended years of careful isolation, with nothing more than an honest, exhausted yawn. He told himself, as Lyra had told herself on her own carriage ride home days earlier, that his interest was purely a matter of curiosity, a king's natural desire to understand an anomaly within his kingdom. But he found himself remembering small, inconsequential details that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity at all. The particular way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the dry humor she offered, even in the middle of an uncomfortable examination, the quiet steadiness in her voice when she had asked him whether his isolation had been difficult, as though she genuinely cared about the answer, rather than simply performing polite concern. He found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, looking forward to something. At the infirmary, Lyra found herself equally unable to stop thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. Clara had taken to teasing her relentlessly about the increasingly frequent visits from palace messengers, though Lyra insisted, with rapidly diminishing conviction, that the arrangement was purely a matter of scientific interest on the king's part. Scientific interest does not require a king to personally deliver updates about his healer's research findings, Clara pointed out one afternoon, watching Lyra read through a note that had arrived that morning, informing her that Rosalind had located some promising historical records and requesting her presence at the palace the following day. "He has advisors and healers to manage such things," Lyra argued weakly. "It is simply more efficient for me to be informed directly." "Lyra," Clara set down the linens she had been folding, and fixed her friend with a pointed look. "The Alpha King of this entire kingdom is personally overseeing updates about your medical examinations. That is not efficiency, that is interest." Lyra opened her mouth to argue further, then closed it again, uncertain how to refute something she was increasingly struggling to deny even to herself. There was something about her conversations with Cale that felt different from anything she had experienced before. Not the careful, distant formality she might have expected from royalty, but a genuine curiosity, a willingness to be honest about things she suspected he rarely discussed with anyone. "Even if that were true," she said finally, "nothing could come of it. He is the Alpha King. I am an infirmary worker with a younger brother to support, and no family name worth mentioning. Whatever this is, it cannot be anything more than what it appears to be." Clara's expression softened slightly, though the teasing glint in her eyes did not entirely fade, perhaps. "But you should be honest with yourself, at least, about what you are feeling, even if nothing ever comes of it." Lyra did not have a ready answer for that, and Clara, sensing she had pushed the conversation as far as it needed to go for the moment, returned to her work without further comment. The following day, Lyra arrived at the palace to find Rosalind waiting in the same small study where her first conversation with Cale had taken place, a stack of old, weathered texts spread across the desk between them. "I believe I may have found something," Rosalind said without preamble, gesturing for Lyra to sit, as Cale entered the room behind her, closing the door softly. "Records from 3 generations past, concerning a small, isolated bloodline in the Northern Territories. According to these accounts, certain individuals within this bloodline demonstrated a natural resistance to alpha auras, though the records are frustratingly vague about the cause." "A bloodline?" Lyra repeated, frowning. "I have no knowledge of any unusual family history. My mother never mentioned anything of the sort. Do you know anything of your mother's family before she settled in your district?" Rosalind asked. Lyra hesitated, searching her memory. "Very little. My mother rarely spoke of her past. She always said her family had been simple farmers from the Northern Territories, nothing remarkable. She left home young, before I was born, and never returned." Rosalind exchanged a meaningful glance with Cale. The Northern Territories align with the records I have found. It is possible, though far from certain, that your mother's family carried this trait, dormant for generations, until it manifested unexpectedly in you. Is there any way to confirm this? Cale asked. Not without further records, which may be difficult to locate given how much time has passed, Rosalind admitted. But it would explain a great deal, if true. Some inherited traits skip generations entirely, only to reappear when circumstances allow, though the exact mechanism remains poorly understood, even among the most learned healers. Lyra sat quietly, absorbing the implications of what Rosalind had described. A hidden piece of her mother's history, buried for years, potentially responsible for the strange resistance that had upended her life so unexpectedly. She thought of her mother's tired eyes in the final months before her passing, the quiet sadness she had always carried, but never fully explained, and wondered what other secrets might have gone unspoken between them. "Thank you for your research," she said finally. "Even an uncertain answer is better than none at all." Rosalind gathered her texts and excused herself, leaving Cale and Lyra alone in the study once more, the fire crackling softly between them. "You seem troubled," Cale observed, watching her closely. "I am only thinking of my mother," Lyra admitted. "She passed 3 years ago, and I always believed I knew everything important about her life. Discovering there may have been an entire history she never shared with me is difficult to process." "I am sorry for your loss," Cale said quietly, "and I am sorry that our search for answers has stirred up memories you may have preferred to leave undisturbed." "No," Lyra said, shaking her head. "I would rather know the truth, even an uncertain version of it, than continue wondering. Thank you for helping me understand this, even if we are still far from a complete answer." Cale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his gray eyes. "I confess my interest in this matter has grown beyond simple curiosity about my own condition, Lyra. I find myself invested in understanding you, not merely the anomaly you represent." Lyra's breath caught slightly at the quiet admission, uncertain how to respond to such open honesty from a man she had believed, only days earlier, ruled his kingdom through careful, guarded distance. "I find myself equally curious about you, Your Majesty," she admitted softly. "Though I confess, I do not fully understand what that means, given the circumstances." "Neither do I," Cale said, a faint, rare smile touching the corner of his mouth. "But I find I do not mind the uncertainty, as much as I once might have." They sat together for a while longer, the conversation drifting away from healers and bloodlines, and settling instead into simpler things: her brother's apprenticeship, the small kindnesses she offered her patients at the infirmary, the quiet burdens he carried as king that few in his court ever thought to ask about. By the time she left the palace that evening, Lyra found herself smiling in a way she had not smiled in a very long time, and Cale found himself once again standing at the window long after she had gone, watching the road until the last traces of the carriage disappeared into the growing dusk. Neither of them spoke aloud what was beginning to grow between them, but both of them, in their own quiet ways, had already begun to understand that something rare and unexpected was taking root, something neither an alpha's aura nor a kingdom's rigid expectations could easily undo. Rosalind's research into the northern bloodlines continued for weeks, though each new discovery seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. Lyra returned to the palace regularly, sometimes for further examinations, sometimes simply to review whatever fragments of history Rosalind had managed to uncover, and increasingly, simply because Cale requested her presence, with no scientific pretense required at all. It was during one such visit, deep in the palace archives, that Lyra first learned the true scope of what her resistance might mean. The archive was a vast, dusty chamber lined with towering shelves of records stretching back centuries, tended by a quiet, elderly archivist named Bertram, who guided Rosalind and Lyra through aisles of crumbling texts, with the careful reverence of a man who considered every document sacred. Cale accompanied them, though he said little, content to observe, as Rosalind and Bertram debated the meaning of increasingly obscure passages. "Here," Rosalind said finally, pulling a thin, leather-bound volume from a high shelf and setting it carefully on a reading table. "This account describes a woman from the Northern Territories, 3 generations past, who reportedly served as a companion to an Alpha Lord without any apparent effect from his presence. The record is brief, but it aligns closely with what we have observed in you, Lyra. Lyra leaned over the ancient text, though the faded, cramped handwriting was difficult to decipher. What became of her? Rosalind's expression grew somber. The record does not say. Such accounts were rarely preserved with much detail, particularly concerning Omegas of no noble birth. It is possible she lived a long, quiet life. It is equally possible her story ended less fortunately. Why would her story end unfortunately? Lyra asked, a note of unease creeping into her voice. Cale answered before Rosalind could, his voice quiet but firm. Because an Omega who does not respond to an Alpha's presence the way tradition expects can be seen as a threat to the established order, rather than simply an anomaly to be studied. Some in positions of power do not react well to anything that challenges the natural hierarchy they depend upon. The weight of his words settled uncomfortably over the small group. Lyra had not previously considered that her unusual resistance might be viewed as anything other than a curious medical mystery. The idea that it could be perceived as a threat, that it might place her in danger from those who valued tradition over understanding, was a new and unsettling thought. "Do you believe I am in danger?" she asked Cale directly. He met her eyes, his expression carefully controlled, though she had learned enough about him by now to recognize the genuine concern hidden beneath his composure. "I believe it is wise to be cautious. Not every member of my court will react to your resistance with the same curiosity Rosalind and I have shown. Some will see it as an affront to tradition. Others may see it as an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" Lyra asked. Cale hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "There are those in my court who have long hoped to see me matched with an Omega who could withstand my presence, believing it would strengthen the kingdom's stability, secure my bloodline, and settle questions of succession that have lingered for years. If word of your resistance spreads beyond this small circle, you may find yourself the subject of far more attention than you would like, from people whose motives are not nearly as simple as Rosalind's scientific curiosity." Lyra absorbed this new information slowly, understanding for the first time the political weight her simple, unexplained resistance carried. She had come to the palace as a curiosity, a mystery to be solved. She had not considered that she might, without ever intending to, become something far more significant within the kingdom's careful, delicate politics. "I did not ask for any of this," she said quietly. "I only fell asleep because I had not slept in 3 days." "I know," Cale said, his voice gentler now, "and I take full responsibility for the situation you now find yourself in. If you wish to withdraw from these examinations, to return to your quiet life at the infirmary, and leave this matter behind entirely, I will not stop you, nor will I hold it against you." Lyra considered the offer carefully, weighing the quiet, familiar comfort of her old life against the strange, uncertain path that had opened before her since that fateful ceremony. She thought of the loneliness Cale had described, the years of isolation he had carried without complaint, and the small, genuine warmth that had grown between them over the past weeks, despite the odds stacked against it. "I do not wish to withdraw," she said finally. "Whatever complications this brings, I find I am not willing to simply walk away from it, from you." Something shifted in Cale's expression at her words, a rare and unguarded softness that Rosalind and Bertram, tactfully, pretended not to notice as they returned their attention to the ancient texts spread across the table. "Then we will face whatever comes together," Cale said quietly, "and I will do everything within my power to ensure you are protected, regardless of what any member of my court might think of the matter." The research continued for the remainder of the afternoon, though Lyra found it increasingly difficult to focus on the ancient records, her mind instead turning over the quiet promise Cale had made, and her own equally quiet admission of how deeply she had come to care for him in such a short span of time. As evening approached and the archive grew dim with the fading light, Rosalind and Bertram excused themselves to continue their research the following day, leaving Cale and Lyra alone amid the towering shelves of history. "May I walk you to your carriage?" Cale asked, offering his arm in a gesture that felt, despite its simplicity, remarkably significant given everything that had passed between them. "I would like that," Lyra said, accepting the offer with a small, genuine smile. They walked together through the quiet palace corridors, their conversation drifting away from bloodlines and political dangers and settling instead into easier, more personal territory. Cale asked about her brother's progress at the blacksmith's forge. Lyra asked about the pressures of ruling a kingdom that few beyond the palace walls ever fully understood. By the time they reached the courtyard where her carriage waited, the earlier tension had eased into something warmer, something that felt, despite the uncertainty surrounding them, remarkably like the beginning of something neither of them was quite ready to name. "Thank you for today," Lyra said, pausing before climbing into the carriage. "For your honesty, and for your promise to keep me safe, even though none of this was ever your intention." "I find I do not regret any of it," Kale said quietly. "Whatever complications lie ahead, I would not trade the past weeks for the quiet isolation I lived in before you arrived." Lyra felt her cheeks warm at his words, and for a moment, standing together in the fading evening light, the vast distance between an Alpha King and an Infirmary Omega seemed to shrink into something far more manageable than either of them had believed possible only weeks earlier. "Good night, Kale," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "Good night, Lyra," he replied, watching as she climbed into the carriage, unable to keep the small, genuine smile from his face as it rolled away into the darkening evening. Neither of them yet knew how quickly the quiet warmth of that evening would be tested. But for the moment, standing alone in the courtyard as the stars began to emerge overhead, Kale allowed himself, for the first time in years, to simply feel content. The council chamber had never been a place where anyone dared question the Alpha King's judgment, but by the fourth week of Lyra's regular visits to the palace, the murmurs among Kale's advisors had grown difficult to ignore entirely. "You missed the entire discussion regarding the Eastern trade agreements, Your Majesty," General Garrick Thorne said bluntly, during one particularly tense council session, his weathered face set in the same stern expression he had worn through 3 decades of loyal service to the crown. "Twice this month, you have left council meetings early, citing matters that require your personal attention elsewhere." "The matters were legitimate," Kale said, his tone even, though a faint tightness around his eyes suggested he was growing weary of the scrutiny. "I do not doubt that, Your Majesty," Garrick continued, undeterred. "But the entire court has noticed your increased visits to the district infirmary, and your continued patronage of the healer's research into a particular Omega's unusual condition. Forgive my bluntness, but the kingdom requires a king whose full attention remains on matters of state, not personal curiosities, however interesting they may be." A tense silence settled over the council chamber. Edmund, seated near the king's right hand, kept his expression carefully neutral, though he had privately anticipated this confrontation for weeks. "My personal curiosities, as you call them, have direct bearing on matters of state," Kale said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had never failed to command respect, even from a general as blunt as Garrick. "An Omega who does not respond to my presence represents something unprecedented in this kingdom's history. Understanding that phenomenon is not a frivolous pursuit." "With respect, Your Majesty," Garrick pressed, "the entire court whispers that your interest extends well beyond scientific curiosity. If those rumors reach beyond these walls, they carry political weight you may not have fully considered." Kale's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, another voice cut smoothly through the tension. "Perhaps the general raises a fair point, though I confess I find the rumors rather charming myself." All eyes turned toward the newest arrival to the council chamber, a young noblewoman seated near the far end of the table, her posture perfectly composed, her expression carrying the polished, practiced warmth of someone raised from birth to navigate the delicate politics of court life. Vivienne Castellan, daughter of one of the kingdom's oldest and most influential noble houses, had been positioned since childhood as a likely candidate for the king's eventual match, though Kale's lifelong isolation had made any formal courtship impossible until now. "Lady Castellan," Kale said, his tone carefully neutral. "I did not realize you had been invited to this council session." "Forgive my intrusion, Your Majesty," Vivienne said smoothly, though the faint edge in her voice suggested her presence was anything but accidental. "I merely wish to offer my support regarding the general's concerns. The kingdom has waited a long time for its king to find companionship, and I would hate to see hasty rumors surrounding an infirmary worker cause unnecessary distraction from more suitable arrangements." Edmund watched the exchange with growing unease, recognizing immediately the careful, deliberate positioning behind Vivienne's polished words. She had spent years cultivating her position as the court's expected future queen, and the sudden emergence of Lyra Wren, however unintentional, clearly represented a threat she did not intend to ignore quietly. "I appreciate your concern, Lady Castellan," Kale said, his tone cooling noticeably, "but my personal arrangements are not a matter for council discussion." "Of course, Your Majesty," Vivienne said, inclining her head with practiced grace, though her sharp eyes lingered on him a moment longer than strict propriety allowed. "I only wish to remind the council of the kingdom's need for stability, particularly regarding matters of succession. An infirmary worker of no noble standing, however unusual her condition, seems an unlikely foundation for the security this kingdom requires." The council session continued for another hour. Though Kale found it increasingly difficult to focus, Vivienne's carefully worded warning echoing in his mind long after the meeting concluded. He had known, in some distant corner of his awareness, that his growing attachment to Lyra would eventually draw attention from those within the court who valued tradition and political convenience over anything as unpredictable as genuine feeling. He had simply hoped for more time before that reckoning arrived. Edmund found him afterward, standing alone in his private study, staring out over the palace grounds with an expression of quiet, troubled contemplation. "Lady Castellan has been positioning herself as your likely match for years, Your Majesty," Edmund said carefully. "Her family holds significant influence within the council. I would advise caution in how openly you continue your association with Miss Wren, at least until matters settle." "I will not hide Lyra away as though she were something shameful," Kale said firmly. "She has done nothing wrong beyond existing as an unexpected exception to a rule that has defined my life since childhood." "I am not suggesting shame, Your Majesty," Edmund said gently. "Only caution. Lady Castellan is not someone who accepts obstacles gracefully, and her family's influence within the council could complicate matters significantly if she decides to actively oppose your growing attachment to Miss Wren." Kale did not respond immediately, his thoughts turning to the warmth he had felt in the courtyard days earlier, watching Lyra's carriage disappear into the evening light, the quiet contentment that had settled over him for the first time in years. He was unwilling to sacrifice that feeling for the sake of political convenience, regardless of what obstacles Vivienne Castellan might attempt to place in his path. "I appreciate your concern, Edmund," he said finally, "but I have spent my entire life making decisions based on duty and political necessity, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of the kingdom's stability. I am not willing to do so any longer, not when I have finally found something worth holding on to." Edmund studied his king for a long moment, recognizing a resolve in his expression that he had rarely seen before, even through years of watching Kale navigate the constant pressures of rule. "Then I will do everything within my power to support you, Your Majesty. But I would advise preparing yourself, and Miss Wren, for the resistance that is likely to follow." Kale nodded slowly, already turning his thoughts toward the challenges that lay ahead. He had faced armies, border disputes, and years of solitary isolation without complaint. He was not about to let the careful political maneuvering of a noblewoman, raised to expect the crown as her birthright, stand between him and the first genuine happiness he had known in his entire life. Across the city, unaware of the tension brewing within the palace walls, Lyra continued her regular shifts at the infirmary, her thoughts increasingly occupied by memories of quiet conversations, gentle honesty, and the warm, steady presence of a king who had, against every expectation, become the person she looked forward to seeing most in the world. She had no way of knowing that her simple, unexpected place in Kale's life had already begun to stir dangerous currents within the palace she had only just begun to understand. Nor did she know how soon those currents would reach her directly, upending the fragile, hopeful peace she had only recently allowed herself to feel. The following week, Kale found Lyra sitting alone in the palace garden after another examination session with Rosalind, her expression distant, her fingers absently tracing the edge of a fallen leaf resting in her lap. He approached slowly, sensing that whatever occupied her thoughts required a gentler presence than his usual composed formality. "You seem far away," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. Lyra offered a small, tired smile. "Rosalind found another record today, a brief mention of my grandmother, from before she left the Northern Territories. It seems she may have carried the same resistance I do, though the record says little else about her." "That must have been difficult to read," Kale said gently. "It was strange, more than difficult," Lyra admitted. "I never knew my grandmother. My mother rarely spoke of her own childhood, and I always assumed it was simply because there was little worth remembering. Now I wonder if there was more to her silence than I ever realized. Kale remained quiet, giving her space to continue if she wished, learning over the past weeks that Lyra often needed a moment of stillness before she was ready to share the deeper parts of herself. My mother worked herself to exhaustion for most of my childhood, Lyra said finally, her voice quiet but steady. She never spoke of my father, and I learned early not to ask. She raised my brother and me alone, took in mending work late into the night, and never once complained about how difficult our lives were, even when I could see how tired she was, how much the weight of it wore on her. She sounds like a remarkable woman, Kale said softly. She was, Lyra agreed, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. When she grew sick 3 years ago, I was the one who cared for her, alongside my work at the infirmary. I learned quickly that fear does very little to help anyone in a crisis. It only slows you down, clouds your judgment when you need clarity the most. So I taught myself not to feel it, or at least not to let it control me, because someone needed to remain steady while everything around us fell apart. Kale watched her carefully, understanding now, with sudden clarity, the true source of the calm, unshaken presence she carried even in his most overwhelming moments. It was not simply exhaustion that had allowed her to withstand his aura that first day in the Great Hall. It was years of hard-earned resilience, forged through loss and hardship long before she had ever crossed his path. Your resistance is not merely a matter of bloodline then, he said quietly. It is something you built yourself, through everything you have survived. Lyra considered his words for a long moment. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps whatever trait my grandmother carried gave me a foundation, and everything I lived through afterward simply strengthened it further. I do not know. I only know that very little frightens me the way it seems to frighten others, and I have never fully understood why, until you began asking these questions. I am sorry for everything you endured, Kale said, his voice thick with genuine sympathy. No one should have to learn such difficult lessons so young. I do not regret it, Lyra said, surprising him slightly. It made me who I am. It taught me how to care for others, how to remain steady when everything feels uncertain. If it also gave me the strength to stand before you without fear, then perhaps some good came from all that hardship after all. Kale reached out, hesitating only briefly, before gently taking her hand in his own, a small, careful gesture that carried far more weight than its simplicity suggested. I have spent my entire life believing my aura made genuine connection impossible for me. I never imagined that the person who would finally prove that belief wrong would be someone who had already faced far greater trials than simply standing near an overpowering alpha. Lyra's fingers curled gently around his, her earlier sadness easing into something warmer, more hopeful. Perhaps that is why it worked, in the end. I was never afraid of your power, Kale, because I had already learned not to be afraid of the things that once felt impossible to survive. They sat together in comfortable silence as the evening light faded around them, the garden growing quiet, except for the distant sound of birds settling into the trees for the night. For the first time since her mother's passing, Lyra felt herself letting go of a burden she had carried alone for years, sharing it instead with someone who listened, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. Owen worries about me, she said after a while, referring to her younger brother. He believes I work myself too hard, the same way our mother did. I have tried to reassure him, but I think he sees more of her sacrifice reflected in me than I would like to admit. He sounds like he cares for you deeply, Kale said. He does, Lyra agreed. He is the only family I have left, and I would do anything to ensure he has a better start in life than either of us were given. That is part of why none of this, she gestured vaguely between them, encompassing the palace, the examinations, the quiet, growing bond neither of them had expected, makes complete sense to me. I never imagined my life extending beyond the infirmary and caring for my brother. I certainly never imagined finding myself here, with you. Does that frighten you? Kale asked carefully. Lyra considered the question honestly before answering. A little, not because of your aura, or your power, but because of everything it might mean for my future, for Owen's future, if this continues to grow into something more. The kingdom will not easily accept an infirmary worker as anything more than a passing curiosity in your life. I do not care what the kingdom expects, Kale said firmly, his grip on her hand tightening gently. I have spent my entire life sacrificing my own happiness for duty, and I find I am no longer willing to continue that pattern, not when the alternative means giving up something as rare and meaningful as what has grown between us. Lyra studied his face in the fading light, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and finding none. Then perhaps we should face whatever comes together, rather than allowing fear of the future to steal away what little peace we have managed to find. I would like that very much, Cale said, a rare, genuine smile softening his usually composed features. They remained in the garden until the stars emerged fully overhead, their conversation drifting into easier, lighter territory, as the weight of shared history settled into something more comfortable between them. Neither of them spoke yet of what the future might hold, of the political complications Vivian Castellan and General Thorne had already begun stirring within the council chamber, or of the uncertain path that lay ahead for an Alpha King and an Infirmary Omega whose bond defied every expectation the kingdom held. For that quiet evening, at least, none of it mattered. There was only the warmth of shared understanding, the comfort of finally being known, and the fragile, precious beginning of something neither of them intended to let go of easily. Vivian Castellan did not rise to her position within the court by allowing obstacles to remain in her path for long, and the growing warmth between Cale and Lyra represented precisely the kind of obstacle she had no intention of tolerating. She began carefully, as she did with most matters requiring delicate handling, a quiet word here, a suggestive comment there, planted among the nobles most likely to spread rumors quickly and efficiently. Within days, whispers had spread through the entire court regarding the king's suspicious infatuation with a common infirmary worker, an Omega of no family standing, whose sudden immunity to his aura seemed, to some ears, more convenient than coincidental. Some say she may have used forbidden methods to suppress her natural response, one noblewoman murmured during a private gathering Vivian had carefully arranged, loud enough to ensure the sentiment spread. It seems remarkably fortunate timing, does it not, for an unmatched Omega to suddenly develop such a rare and valuable trait? Vivian said nothing to confirm or deny the suggestion directly, allowing the seed of doubt to take root on its own, content to watch it grow, without needing to involve herself further in its cultivation. By the time the rumors reached Edmund's ears, they had grown considerably more elaborate, suggesting Lyra had somehow manipulated her resistance through underhanded means, perhaps even endangering the king's well-being through whatever method she had supposedly employed. Edmund recognized immediately the careful, deliberate construction behind such claims, though proving their origin would require evidence he did not yet possess. "You must warn Miss Wren," Edmund told Cale urgently, finding him in his study late one evening. "The rumors have grown dangerous, Your Majesty. Some among the court are suggesting her resistance was manufactured through forbidden means, rather than a natural trait. If such claims gain enough traction, they could be used to justify actions against her that neither of us would wish to see." Cale's expression darkened immediately. "Who is spreading these claims?" "I cannot say with certainty," Edmund admitted, though the timing and the particular nobles involved suggest Lady Castellan's influence, whether directly or indirectly. Cale's jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath his usually composed exterior. He had expected resistance to his growing bond with Lyra, had braced himself for political inconvenience and courtly disapproval. He had not anticipated deliberate, malicious rumors designed to endanger her safety. "Summon Lady Castellan to my private study," he said, his voice cold with restrained fury. "I intend to address this directly." Vivian arrived within the hour, her composed expression revealing nothing of whatever satisfaction she might have felt at successfully drawing the king's attention, however unfavorable the circumstances. "You wish to see me, Your Majesty," she said, her tone perfectly polite. "I am aware of the rumors circulating regarding Miss Wren's resistance," Cale said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that few in the court had ever heard directed at them. "I am also aware of your involvement in spreading them." Vivian's expression remained carefully neutral, though a flicker of something calculating passed behind her eyes. "I am not certain what you mean, Your Majesty. I have merely expressed concern, as have many others in the court, regarding the unusual and convenient timing of Miss Wren's condition." "Convenient for whom?" Cale demanded. "She did not seek this attention. She did not ask to be examined, questioned, or subjected to the scrutiny of my entire council. If anyone has benefited from convenient circumstances in this matter, it is not Lyra Wren. Perhaps not intentionally, Vivian said smoothly, though her composure was beginning to show the faintest cracks under the weight of Cale's obvious anger. But surely you understand, Your Majesty, that the kingdom's stability depends on a match that strengthens rather than complicates matters of succession. An unproven, unexplained resistance from an Omega with no noble standing raises legitimate concerns, regardless of how genuine her feelings for you may or may not be. Her feelings are genuine, Cale said firmly, as are mine. And I will not allow baseless rumors, spread for the sake of political convenience, to endanger her safety or reputation. Vivian studied him for a long moment, recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the true depth of his resolve regarding Lyra. Whatever hope she had harbored of reclaiming her expected position through careful political maneuvering seemed, in that moment, to crumble considerably. I understand, Your Majesty, she said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier calculated edge. I will ensure the rumors are addressed and corrected, to whatever extent remains within my influence. See that you do, Cale said. And Lady Castellan, I would advise against any further attempts to undermine Miss Wren's position within this court. I have been patient thus far, out of respect for your family's long service to the crown. That patience has limits. Vivian bowed, and left the study without further argument, though the tightness in her expression suggested the matter was far from settled in her own mind, regardless of the king's clear warning. Meanwhile, unaware of the political storm brewing on her behalf, Lyra continued her work at the infirmary, though she had begun to notice the subtle shift in how certain palace staff regarded her during her visits. The sideways glances, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, the careful, guarded politeness that felt distinctly different from the warm curiosity she had grown accustomed to during her early examinations. Something is wrong, she said to Clara one evening, after returning from another palace visit, with a troubled expression she could not fully disguise. I do not know exactly what, but something has changed. People look at me differently now. What kind of differently? Clara asked, concern immediately evident in her voice. As though they suspect me of something, Lyra admitted. I cannot explain it further than that. It simply feels as though the goodwill I had earned in the palace has begun to curdle into something else entirely. Clara's expression grew troubled as well, though she offered what comfort she could. Perhaps it is only your imagination, worn thin from exhaustion, and the strangeness of everything that has happened these past weeks. Perhaps, Lyra said, though she did not sound entirely convinced. She had no way of knowing, in that quiet moment, just how close the danger Cale had worked so hard to shield her from truly was, nor how quickly the fragile peace she had found within the palace walls would soon be tested in ways far more direct than whispered rumors and suspicious glances. The confrontation Cale had hoped to avoid arrived sooner than either he or Lyra anticipated, and it did not come from Vivian Castellan directly, but from the far more dangerous ground of open council debate. General Garrick Thorne called an emergency session, citing concerns that had, by his account, grown too significant to address through private conversation alone. Cale arrived to find the council chamber fuller than usual. Nobles from every corner of the kingdom gathered to hear whatever formal challenge Garrick intended to raise. Your Majesty, Garrick began, his tone respectful but firm. The rumors surrounding Miss Wren's unusual resistance have grown too widespread to ignore. Whether or not they carry any truth, the kingdom's confidence in the stability of your eventual match requires a clear, formal accounting of the matter, conducted openly before this council, rather than continued private examinations behind closed doors. Cale's jaw tightened, though he maintained his composure, recognizing the trap being carefully laid before him. To refuse an open accounting would only fuel further suspicion. To agree would mean subjecting Lyra to the very scrutiny and danger he had worked so hard to shield her from. I have already confirmed, through healer Rosalind's thorough examination, that Miss Wren's resistance is a natural trait, likely inherited from a northern bloodline documented in the palace archives, Cale said. I see no need for further public spectacle regarding a matter already settled through proper medical investigation. With respect, Your Majesty, Garrick pressed. Private examinations conducted by healers under your personal authority carry less weight, with a council increasingly divided on the matter. A public accounting, before witnesses beyond your immediate circle, would settle the question definitively and quiet the rumors threatening to destabilize confidence in your eventual succession. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled nobles, and Cale felt, for the first time since this entire situation had begun, the true weight of the political forces arrayed against him. He glanced toward Edmund, who offered only a small, grim nod, silently confirming that refusing the council's demand entirely was no longer a viable option. "Very well," Cale said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Miss Wren will be summoned before the full council for a formal accounting, but I will not tolerate any accusations made without evidence, nor any attempt to endanger her safety under the guise of political necessity." Lyra received the summons the following morning, delivered by a palace guard whose grim expression told her, before he even spoke, that whatever awaited her at the palace carried far greater weight than her previous visits. "The full council, Your Majesty?" she repeated, her voice tight with barely restrained panic once she arrived at the palace, and Cale explained the situation directly. "In front of the entire court?" "I am so sorry, Lyra," Cale said, his composure cracking slightly under the weight of his own guilt. "I tried to prevent this, but the council's concerns have grown too significant to ignore through private means alone. I promise you, I will not allow anyone to harm you, regardless of what accusations are raised." Lyra took a steadying breath, drawing on the same hard-earned resilience that had carried her through her mother's illness, through years of exhausting infirmary shifts, through every difficult moment life had thrown at her, before this strange, unexpected chapter had begun. "Then I will face them. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not hide from accusations I know to be false." The council chamber, when Lyra entered it hours later, felt far more intimidating than the great hall where she had first met Cale. Rows of nobles lined the walls, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile, while Garrick Thorne stood near the center of the room, prepared to lead the formal questioning. Vivian Castellan sat near the front, her composed expression revealing nothing, though Lyra could feel the weight of her attention nonetheless. "Miss Wren," Garrick began, his tone formal but not unkind, "you understand why this council requires a clear accounting of your unusual resistance to His Majesty's presence." "I understand," Lyra said, her voice steadier than she felt, drawing strength from Cale's presence beside the throne, watching her with quiet, fierce support. "Some among this council have suggested your resistance may have been artificially achieved, through forbidden means, designed to secure influence over the crown," Garrick continued. "Do you deny these claims?" "I deny them completely," Lyra said firmly. "I have never sought influence over the crown, nor did I seek out this situation in any way. I fell asleep during the presentation ceremony, because I had worked 3 consecutive shifts at the infirmary, without rest, nothing more calculated than simple exhaustion. Everything that has happened since has come as a surprise to me, as much as to anyone in this room." "A convenient explanation," one noble called out from the back of the chamber, drawing murmurs of agreement from several others. "It is the truth," Lyra said, her voice rising slightly, though she kept her composure intact. "I have submitted to every examination Healer Rosalind requested. I have answered every question honestly. I have nothing to hide, and I resent the implication that simple exhaustion, and whatever trait I may have inherited from my family, constitutes some elaborate scheme against the crown." Cale rose from his throne, unable to remain silent any longer, as the questioning grew increasingly hostile. "This council has demanded its accounting, and Miss Wren has answered honestly and completely. Healer Rosalind's examinations, conducted over weeks of careful observation, confirm her resistance is a natural trait, not an artificial one. I will not permit further baseless accusations against her character." "Your Majesty," Vivian said, finally speaking, her voice carrying the same practiced calm she had maintained throughout the proceedings. "No one doubts the sincerity of your feelings, but the kingdom deserves a king whose judgment is not clouded by personal attachment, however genuine. Miss Wren may well be innocent of any deliberate scheme, but that does not change the political reality that an unmatched, common-born Omega raises legitimate questions about the stability of your eventual succession." Cale's gray eyes locked onto Vivian's with an intensity that silenced the murmuring court immediately. "I have spent my entire life sacrificing personal happiness for the sake of political convenience and duty, Lady Castellan. I ruled alone, isolated from any genuine connection, because my aura made such connection impossible. For every Omega I ever encountered, I accepted that isolation, because I believed I had no other choice. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled council, his voice growing steadier and more resolute with every word. I no longer believe that. Lyra Wren has shown me, for the first time in my entire life, what it means to be known by someone, without fear, without submission, forced upon them by a power I never asked for and never wanted. I will not sacrifice that connection for the sake of political convenience, nor will I allow this council to continue treating her as a threat, rather than the remarkable, resilient woman she has proven herself to be. The council chamber fell into stunned silence. Nobles exchanged wide-eyed glances, clearly unprepared for such an open, unguarded declaration from a king known throughout his reign for careful, measured restraint. I do not want a queen who fears me, Cale continued, his voice quiet now, though it carried through the silent chamber with unmistakable clarity. I do not want a match built on political convenience and forced submission. I want the Omega, who fell asleep in front of me, unimpressed and unafraid, because she saw me as nothing more than a tired stranger, standing in her way at the end of a very long shift. Lyra felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to his words, the weight of his open, public declaration settling over her with a warmth that overwhelmed the earlier fear and tension of the council's hostile questioning. Garrick Thorne, watching the exchange with careful, calculating eyes, finally spoke into the stunned silence. Your Majesty's feelings are clear, but feelings alone do not settle questions of succession and stability that this council must ultimately answer. Then let us settle them properly, Cale said, turning to address the entire chamber. I intend to formally court Lyra Wren, with the full transparency this council has demanded. If her resistance proves as stable and genuine as Healer Rosalind's examinations suggest, then I see no reason why an inherited trait, however unprecedented, should disqualify her from a future beside me, regardless of the family name she was born into. The chamber remained tense, though the earlier hostility had shifted into something more uncertain, nobles clearly recalculating their positions in light of the king's unmistakable resolve. Vivienne said nothing further, her earlier composure finally faltering into something closer to resignation, recognizing that her carefully constructed opposition had failed against the sheer force of Cale's open declaration. As the council session finally concluded and the chamber began to empty, Cale crossed the room directly to where Lyra still stood, her earlier fear giving way to quiet, overwhelmed relief. I am sorry you had to endure that, he said softly, taking her hands in his own, uncaring of the lingering nobles who watched the gesture with open curiosity. I would endure it again, if it meant hearing what you said today, Lyra replied, her voice thick with emotion. No one has ever spoken of me the way you just did, in front of an entire court, without fear of what it might cost you politically. You are worth far more than political convenience, Cale said firmly. I intend to make sure the entire kingdom understands that, whatever obstacles remain ahead of us. Together, they left the council chamber, leaving behind a court, still processing the unprecedented declaration they had just witnessed, and a future that, despite the challenges still ahead, finally felt within their reach. In the weeks that followed the council's tense session, the kingdom slowly adjusted to a truth few had ever expected to witness. The Alpha King, whose overwhelming presence had isolated him since childhood, had found someone capable of standing beside him without fear. Rosalind's continued research confirmed, beyond reasonable doubt, that Lyra's resistance stemmed from the inherited northern bloodline, strengthened further by the resilience she had built through years of hardship and quiet, steady endurance. The formal findings, presented openly before the council, silenced most of the remaining doubts that Vivienne's earlier rumors had attempted to plant, though Vivienne herself withdrew from court politics for a time, retreating to her family estate to reconsider her position within a kingdom whose future no longer aligned with her own ambitions. General Garrick Thorne, true to his blunt but ultimately honorable nature, offered his formal support once the evidence became undeniable, acknowledging before the full council that a king who ruled with genuine partnership rather than isolated authority might in fact prove a greater asset to the kingdom's long-term stability than any politically convenient match ever could. Lyra continued her work at the infirmary throughout the courtship, refusing to abandon the patients and colleagues who had supported her long before any of this began. Clara teased her relentlessly about the growing formality of palace visits, though her teasing carried unmistakable pride and happiness for her friend's unexpected, remarkable turn of fortune. Owen, initially wary of the sudden royal attention surrounding his sister, gradually warmed to Cale's genuine, unpretentious kindness, eventually admitting, with the blunt honesty only a younger sibling could offer, that he approved of anyone who made his sister smile, as often as she had begun to smile in recent months. Cale, for his part, found himself transformed by the steady, unafraid presence Lyra brought into his life. Council meetings that once felt like exhausting exercises in careful isolation now carried a warmth he had never previously known, buoyed by the knowledge that at the end of each long day, he had someone to return to who saw him not as an overwhelming force to be feared, but simply as a man who had spent too many years carrying his burdens alone. Months later, on a bright, clear morning that the entire kingdom would remember for years afterward, Cale and Lyra stood together in the same great hall where their story had first begun, surrounded not by trembling, fearful Omegas, but by a court that had finally come to understand and accept the remarkable bond between their king and the infirmary worker who had once fallen asleep in front of him. "Do you remember what you asked me, that first day you summoned me to the palace?" Lyra asked quietly, standing beside Cale, as they prepared to greet the gathered crowd. "I asked if you felt anything," Cale said, a warm smile touching his features as he recalled the memory. "Any pressure, any weight pressing down on you." "And I told you I felt nothing but tiredness," Lyra said, smiling as well. "I did not understand then how much that simple, honest answer would change both our lives." "Neither did I," Cale admitted, taking her hand in his own, the same gesture that had once caused an entire council chamber to fall silent, now simply a natural, comfortable part of their daily life together. "I spent years believing my aura made genuine connection impossible for me. I was wrong. I simply had not yet met the one person strong enough and steady enough to stand beside me without fear." Lyra squeezed his hand gently, her eyes bright with quiet, contented happiness. "I was not looking for a king that day in the great hall. I was only looking for a moment's rest after far too many exhausting shifts." "And instead, you found me," Cale said softly. "And instead, I found you," Lyra agreed. "Not as an overwhelming force to be feared, or a curiosity to be studied, but simply as someone who had been waiting, quietly and patiently, for someone who was not looking for a king at all." The kingdom, watching its Alpha King stand before them with a genuine, unguarded warmth few had ever witnessed in him before, understood at last what the entire court had slowly come to accept over the preceding months. The curse that had isolated Cale Ashgrave for his entire life had never truly been a curse at all. It had simply been a long, patient wait for the one person capable of meeting him, not with fear or forced submission, but with honest, unshaken acceptance. Rosalind, standing quietly among the gathered healers and advisors, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Her months of careful research finally settled into a conclusion far more meaningful than any medical anomaly. Edmund, ever the loyal steward, watched the scene with quiet pride, grateful to have witnessed his king finally find the companionship he had believed, for so many years, would always remain beyond his reach. And Lyra Wren, once an exhausted infirmary worker who had simply fallen asleep at the wrong, or perhaps exactly the right, moment, stood beside the Alpha King of the realm, no longer burdened by fear of what the future might hold, but instead looking forward, with quiet, steady confidence, to whatever challenges and joys still awaited them both. The kingdom watched its king, for the first time in living memory, look completely and genuinely at peace, and beside him, Lyra Wren, unafraid and unwavering, smiled back at the life she had never expected, but had in the end, chosen wholeheartedly for herself. Their story, unlike so many others whispered through palace corridors, was never truly about a curse, or an unusual resistance, or the political complications of an unlikely match. It was, in the end, simply the story of two people who had each spent years enduring their own quiet burdens alone, until an unexpected moment of honest exhaustion brought them together, and neither of them had ever let go since.